Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Retro Media Nickel Show. Today, we'll be taking a look at a cartoon that I'm sure you all remember fondly. You know the one I'm talking about. Stars a group of teenagers traveling the world in their speed buggy, solving mysteries with their wacky sidekick, Captain Caveman, and at the end of the day, they all perform in a music show to... Wait a second. I know what I had it in here some... Oh, here it is. In the late 1960s, animation on television was seeing a huge amount of action. Theatrical shorts had all but completely died out at this point, with families firmly preferring to watch the free television at home as opposed to paying about $1.20 per show to watch a single cartoon before a movie. This meant that the television became something the whole family watched together, and especially important was that the parents were right there with their children, seeing it all alongside them. As one might expect, this had an effect on how parents were reacting to the media their children were watching. Groups of parents started to form, being concerned that their children's programming was becoming way too violent, particularly pointing to Hanna-Barbera's action-adventure shows, such as Space Ghost, The Herculoids, and Birdman and the Galaxy Trio, with all eventually being cancelled in 1969 due to pressure from these groups. In response, the channels CBS and ABC were both making attempts to find more shows to fill their Saturday morning time slots. The first attempt came from a studio called Filmation. Nowadays, they're more known for their work on Fat Albert. Their response to the parents' complaints? A show based on the adventures of Archie, being from the long-running comic books of the same name. It was to star a group of teenagers, the titular Archie Andrews, his food-loving best friend Jughead Jones, the sarcastic Reggie Mantle, and Archie's two on-again, off-again love interests, Veronica Lodge and Betty Cooper. The group would play together in a bubblegum pop band, a style of music usually noted as being extremely safe, clean, and generally disposable. But when not performing, the gang would typically be involved in very safe, slice-of-life scenarios that rarely felt more enthralling than an algebra class. Bores me to tears today, but it was cute and safe, and they liked it. So, for the 1969 season, CBS felt as though it had a real hit on their hands, and they turned back to the animation industry, specifically requesting a show from Hanna-Barbera to follow up on that formula that they could play at around the same time. Hanna-Barbera looked to shake up the formula laid by the Archie show, and found their inspiration in mystery. Inspired by the 1940s radio serials such as I Love a Mystery, they decided to incorporate, well, mysteries. By taking the cast of Archie and making them into a ragtag group of mystery solvers, the show would be able to provide more exciting storylines and still toe the line of light horror concepts. The show would go through a few initial titles, beginning with House of Mystery and later The Mysterious Five, but as it was getting into its design phase, they had settled upon the idea of an animal sidekick to tie the group together. Initially called Too Much, they picked a Great Dane as their animal due to the contrast of having a large but cowardly animal. During their second pass of character designing, the teenagers starring in the show would be inspired by the characters from The Many Loves of Dobie Gills, an American sitcom from 1963, which had also starred a group of teenagers. Keeping Too Much in the roster, the show was pitched to the head of CBS programming, Fred Silverman, with the title Mysteries 5, but disliking that option, Silverman changed it to Who's Scared. When it was pitched again to executives, they opted out due to the conceptual artwork being too scary for what they felt was appropriate for children. However, still missing that Saturday morning slot, CBS let the team go back and revise the concepts to give it another shot. So their goals for the final concept were tone it down, ditch the band concept, and rename the dog to something more catchy. And with some help from Frank Sinatra's little bit of scatting at the end of Strangers in the Night, where he sings Dooby-Dooby-Doo, Scooby-Doo was indeed chosen to be the final name, and with it, the show's final name as well. Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Was pitched, approved, and premiered on September 13th, 1969. For a children's show at the time, it got very good ratings and became not only well-known, but a pop culture icon. It seemed like every kid in America was watching the escapades of the gang in the Mystery Machine. Seeing the success that Scooby-Doo had, CBS, ABC, and other networks wanted more. The networks wanted to cash in on the trend and wanted more shows like Scooby-Doo to fill up the rest of the time slot. So everyone flooded Hanna-Barbera with requests for shows because who better to make a clone of Scooby-Doo than the people who made it in the first place? Hanna-Barbera was, of course, happy to fill these requests because they already had the template for the story. They just had to mix some details around, and so they started pumping out these shows fast, cheap, and they made a lot of money because of it. So, on September 8th, 1973, the first Scooby-Doo show rolled off the assembly line, and it was called Goober and the Ghost Chasers. In Goober and the Ghost Chasers, we have 3 kids: Gilly, the geeky kid, Ted, the Fred, and Tina, who's, well, she's the girl. And, of course, we have the namesake of the show, Goober, this toque-wearing green dog. He's not that bad, but he does very little on the show outside of making a quick one-liner directed at the audience.
I wouldn't give this spot to a cleaner. Sheesh.
He never talks to the other characters either, only the audience. Oh, and he can turn invisible. I don't know why, he just does. And he can't control when it happens either. Guess it's easier to animate a character that's not there. Together, the 4 of them are writing for Ghost Chasers magazine and are always looking for the next big story, although usually they just kind of fall into it by accident. So to get articles for their magazine, they go ghost hunting and use their patented apparition kit, which has a bunch of random stuff like poltergeist powder to get ghost fingerprints, or the haunter taunter to ward off ghosts, or the specter detector, it detects specters, or just whatever they happen to need at the time. But this one's got the double twist. Most of the ghosts are fake, and they're just pretending to be a ghost for one silly reason or another, but then the real ghost would show up that these random people were pretending to be. And the real ghost would help Goober and the Ghost Chasers catch the fake ghost, and then they interview the real ghost for their magazine. Oh, and side note, in 8 of these episodes, characters from the American sitcom The Partridge Family would just show up, played by their original actors, and then just disappear after episode 11. For Funky Phantom, they decided to flip the story elements around. In this one, we've got 3 kids, a dog, a ghost, and a ghost cat. Let's start with the kids. Firstly, there's Augie Anderson, the self-absorbed jock leader, then his friend Skip Gilroy, the smart and outspoken sidekick, and April Stewart, the girl that Skip and Augie are always fighting amongst each other over. Alongside their pet bulldog Elmo, they all discovered and released the titular Funky Phantom, Jonathan Muddlemore, or just Mudsy, and his cat, Boo. So, here's a show where instead of the kids hunting ghosts, they're using a ghost to stop criminals of the living variety. Mostly masked villains like the Raven, or the Houndsman, or the Chicken Man. They ride their vehicle, the Looney Dooney, from town to town, find a mystery, and usually someone doesn't want to go because it looks spooky. Which, oddly enough, is most likely Mudsy, despite, being a ghost from 1776. Then they find the criminal, unmask them, and go along their way. Oh, and the ghosts also have a tendency to turn invisible, which means that they don't have to animate them either.
Oh, what'll we do? Disappear! What else? Oh, that's easy for you to say.
So you can kind of see how all of these shows are kind of the same. Teenagers, dog, mystery, and things turning invisible. Because Scooby-Doo was such a smash hit and everyone wanted their own version, the problem that arose was that the creative ability of the people making these shows was limited because they had to follow a formula. As a result, these artists and animators and writers never had the chance to do anything different on these shows, as Hanna-Barbera would end up going on to make these clones for the next 10 years. Jabberjaw allows us to peek into the lifestyles of international superstar musicians, and it turns out that they apparently also solve mysteries when not playing to a crowd of millions. Here's the band Jabberjaw and the Neptunes, consisting of Biff on lead guitar. He's the strong and steadfast leader, of course. Shelley on tambourine. She's the power-hungry prima donna that considers herself the breakout star. Bubbles on keyboard. The clumsy one who always ends up causing problems. And finally, Clamhead on bass. Clamhead's not really so much a character as he's a catchphrase machine. with a tendency to repeat lines 4 times in a row, saying things like,
Wow, 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 wow. It must be some kind of celebration.
Other than that, he doesn't really do much, but he gets by on nepotism because he's the sidekick and best friend of the last member and headline of the band, Jabberjaw. Jabberjaw, the 15-tall-foot shark with the voice of Curly Howard, is the band's drummer and muscle, but tends to run into trouble living in a society that has a lot of anti-shark policies. What society is that? Well, the year is 2076 and everyone lives underwater, so apparently that means everything is ocean-themed. Typically, the villain of an episode involves some underwater escapade, like freezing the water, looking for Atlantis, or ruining a transmarine race. The show's more about uncovering the villain's plan than it is about uncovering the villain, but it still uses the general mystery of the week formula. Josie and the Pussycats, a spin-off of the Archie comics, is another one of these shows where we follow a band. More human-centric though, and with a bunch more people involved. Here we see Josie, the lead singer, guitarist, songwriter, and head mystery solver. Valerie, the bassist, she's the conscience of the group and a mechanic. Melody, she's the drummer and is a dedicated optimist, but has a strange tic where her ears wiggle when she senses danger. I don't know either. Outside of the actual band, there's quite a few more, like Alan, their handsome and muscular roadie that Josie's got the hots for, Alex, their manager who is a huge coward, his twin sister Alexandra, a huge pain in the rear, always claiming she's the real star despite not actually doing anything in the band, and of course no Scooby-Doo clone is complete without an animal sidekick, although surprisingly, this one doesn't talk. So we have Sebastian the cat, who causes mischief and sits on the sides and snickers at everyone else's misfortunes. Usually the group travels the world on a music tour, but are always finding themselves thrust into the thralls of adventure, forced to stop the devious plot of whichever B-rate villain wants to end the world that day. And in the show's second season, the band traveled to space, and the show was renamed to Josie and the Pussycats in Outer Space. So in case you thought these shows were getting too samey, this season really mixed things up because now they're in space. And, they get another cute animal sidekick, Bleep, who only says bleep, but he can generate sound waves from his mouth. So, as you can see, Josie and the Pussycats really jumped the shark on season 2. Wait a minute, no, Jabberjaw was the shark, not Josie. I got my notes mixed up. Hold on a minute. Okay, so they're all samey, sure. But why did the creatives have to do the same thing over and over? Well, one simple word: money. Animating is expensive, and in the 70s, the audience had moved away from paying to see cartoons in theaters, preferring to stay at home and watch them on TV. If animation studios didn't move over, they'd be out of a job, but the amount of content required for a television show meant that their old way of production just didn't work anymore. They used to make around 8 to 12 high-budget shorts a year, but now they needed 20-minute-long episodes to show every week for 13 weeks in a row. And regardless of which medium you use, a frame of animation is still a frame of animation price-wise. Clearly, they didn't have the money to make movie-quality animation, so they needed every shortcut they could get, and when they found an easy formula to make these shows quickly and cheaply by using cheap animation shortcuts and following the writing formula of a group of kids, a wacky sidekick, mystery of the week, it made the perfect sense to do it. And then we have the TV executives who kept ordering these shows. They want a guaranteed profit, and since TV execs are business people, not artists, their job is to make money, not art, so they tend to be some of the least creative people on the planet. And it's a common strategy to look at whatever is making money and then do your best to copy it, even if they don't understand it, which leads to situations like this, where they copy incredibly basic surface level elements like an animal sidekick and mysteries, and we can see this sort of thing happen even today, like how many flippin' cinematic universes came out after the Marvel's Avengers movies. Executives are old-fashioned and scared of change, so once they find something that works, they'll do it again and again and again, until it stops working. Captain Caveman and the Teen Angels. This one was more like a mixture of Scooby-Doo and the action show Charlie's Angels. And here we can see, just like that show, there are 3 girls as the stars. Dee Dee, the brain and unofficial leader, Brenda, the anxious and timid one who always ends up getting captured, and Taffy, the smart one who comes up with the plans and says the catchphrases, like,
Super terrific!
really a gripping stuff, I'm sure. Finally, we have the world's first superhero, Captain Caveman. Called Cavey for short, Captain Caveman is less of an actual superhero and more like a joke vehicle. He rarely impacts the plot on his own and is kind of just carted around while the other three girls try to get him to do something useful. He has a club that can open up to be anything they need, but rarely turns out to be anything useful. Although his most impressive feat is his ability to fly, which usually fails at the worst possible time. A normal adventure for the group involves them showing up to a new place every episode and then uncovering and foiling the plans of a different villain every time. Speed Buggy takes us along for the high-speed thrills and adventures of a racing crew and their car as they travel through the world, visiting exotic locations, stopping all manner of bad guys, and winning some races too. The crew consists of Mark, the smart one, Debbie, the leader, and Tinker, the best friend of their dune buggy, Speed Buggy. Speed Buggy, or just Speedy, can move around on his own to rather limited success, so one of the crew members needs to be driving Speed Buggy for him to go quickly. His pattern of speaking honestly sounds like a car engine that's about to explode. Typically, they'll be heading towards a race in major cities before getting caught up in a mystery and having to solve said mystery. The villains mostly seem to be interested in ruining or rigging these races too. Scooby-Doo was new territory. A show with 22 minutes of a procedural mystery aimed at children weekly hadn't really been done before. The show was in the unique position of having to take an enormous risk to get its footing, but in the end, that risk was a benefit, as without the pressure of having to follow a formula, the show could develop into the best it could be. The difference between Scooby-Doo and their clones is that what they're trying to copy is the wrong thing to copy. They're copying surface-level, easily identifiable pieces in the hope that it would be a success like Scooby-Doo was. But Scooby-Doo wasn't popular because it used a dog and solved mysteries. It was successful because the show managed to accomplish the rare feat of giving people something they didn't realize they wanted. And you can't copy the act of being new. And funnily enough, because of this, Scooby-Doo was able to grow as a show, while these others couldn't, because they were all trying to be the same thing, whereas Scooby-Doo had no formula to follow. It was just being itself. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kids, very similarly to Josie and Jabberjaw, once again features a band. This time, we see the hit new music group, the titular Sundance Kids. Leading the group is Butch Cassidy, no relation to the famous Outlaw, of course, on lead vocals and guitar, the joke and fun-loving Wally on drums, the constant kidnapped target Merrily on tambourine, and the practical Stephanie on bass. Accompanied by their usual helpful dog Elvis, they work undercover as government agents with their advisor, a supercomputer named Mr. Socrates, who somehow has a dog allergy of all things.
I told you never. I said
Using their codenames Sundance 1 through 4, the gang stops all matter of villainy and solves mystery from under the public's noses. The new Shmoo. I don't know what a Shmoo is, but it looks like a bowling pin that had enough of standing around the alley and decided to get up and go hang out with some teenagers. Shmoo has the miraculous ability to shapeshift into any shape he wants, which is useful for the rest of the mystery-solving gang. Nita acts as the leader, being quite determined to solve their mysteries, and moving headstrong into danger. Her boyfriend Mickey prefers to stick back and make plans, but isn't worried about getting into the nitty-gritty. By comparison, the huge and cowardly Billy Joe would rather turn tail and head back home. The setup is the same that you've been hearing the whole time. The group travels around the country, comes across a mystery, and works to solve it, with the Shmoo providing some small, interesting set pieces with his transformations at least. Despite everything I've said so far, Hanna-Barbera isn't a studio that I would describe as lazy, or uncreative, or worthless. No. They created shows that changed the face of animation and TV for at least the following decade. Cartoon shows with new segments that ran weekly were still very novel at the time, as most studios who produced animation were more or less taking their theatrical shorts, selling them to TV stations, and just re-releasing them so people could watch them at home. And the studios did get some cash out of the deal. It is by far so much harder to create something new than it is to rehash or re-release old ideas. When it comes to entertainment especially, you'll so often find that their audiences will just watch something they're familiar with over a brand new idea, so it's not just that Hanna-Barbera didn't have it in them to make something new or fresh or even halfway memorable. No, they knew how to play the market. And the market wanted more Scooby-Doo. So given the amount of time and expenses that a cartoon can bring, is it really all that surprising that all these shows ended up the way they did? Clue Club. Larry, the leader of the Clue Club, is the instigator and defers his findings to Dottie, who, despite her young age and constant beratement from other club members, is way smarter than the rest of them. Pepper, Dottie's older sister, ends up getting herself kidnapped all the time. Then Dee Dee, deerskin cap in tow, usually tags along with Pepper, always on the hunt for evidence. The gang is followed around by their two dogs, Woofer, a bloodhound who's always accusing anyone and everyone, and Whimper, who's just too old for Woofer's nonsense. Together, they make the Clue Club. They're always ready to go and solve whatever mysteries that Sheriff Bagley may need from them, no matter how strange it gets. And finally, we have the Buford Files. Deep in the swamp country of Finoki, a sleepy old bloodhound named Buford travels alongside two young teenagers, Cindy May and her brother Woody. The two of them mostly just act as sidekicks, but they do actually prove themselves when the time comes. Buford himself doesn't talk much, but he's able to rotate his ears like radar dishes, and his nose responds to clues by lighting up. And just as you'd expect, they travel the swamplands, solving mysteries, and helping people who need it, just with a bit of a southern twang. I think you get the picture at this point. Hanna-Barbera found a winning formula and ran with it. And there were a lot more of these too. Just to name a few, there's the Fonz and the Happy Days Gang, Casper and the Angels, the Galloping Ghost, and the Pebbles and Bam Bam Show, among others. This tactic speaks to a kind of mindset that's still prevalent even now, but in a different form. Consider this. There are many examples of shows that display great writing, composition, world building, what have you, but were never given the chance to flourish because they were not immediately successful enough. You could see a modern comparison to this in streaming services, as a quick look into the movie scene will show many failed attempts as that, such with the cinematic universe I already mentioned, everyone vying for easy and consistent money through making a continued story every year. Too concerned with their profit, they fail to make one good movie and try to plan out the next 5. The next big thing is what everybody's chasing, and ironically, wholly new ideas aren't given the chance to be the next big thing. On the off chance that a new idea does break through, well, then it's time to run that idea into the ground because there's always a trend to follow. Fortunately, Hanna-Barbera eventually would break out of its rut. By the 90s, they had fully transitioned into making great Cartoon Network classics like Two Stupid Dogs, Dexter's Laboratory, and even the pilot for The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, before eventually being absorbed in the Warner Brothers proper. They're looked back on fondly as a creator of many of the memorable and funny cartoons from our childhoods, but there are just as many, if not more, copycats from the same studio, no less, trying to cash in on their own trends, too risk-averse to let anything new succeed. When presented with the opportunity for easy money and merchandising, it can seem like a lucrative idea to imitate or rehash, but challenging yourself, going against the grain, and championing new ideas can create something that the audience may not have even realized they wanted to see. Many new ideas can be met with hesitation or rejection, but the key to making better art than before is to take a risk.